All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Allie Dowds. I'm a staff member at the Reading Public Library and your host for tonight. We are glad that you're all able to join us for the program, Russia's War in Ukraine, the Human Cost. Emily Channell-Justice, Director of Temerty Contemporary Ukraine Program at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, will lead the conversation. A few housekeeping items. I have muted all attendees for the majority of this program. You may unmute when it's time for the Q&A session, which will be at the very end. There is a chat box in which you can submit questions or comments pertaining to the discussion or function of the virtual event. I will check this frequently throughout the hour. Before the start of our programs, it is important for us to recognize the land on which we stand, even more resounding given the topic of tonight. If we could all take a moment and acknowledge that Reading was built upon the seized ancestral lands of the Pawtucket Band of the Massachusetts tribe, and honor the elders who lived here before, the indigenous today, and the generations to come. As we move into our program, let us welcome Emily Channell-Justice. Emily is a sociocultural anthropologist who has been doing research in Ukraine since 2012. She has pursued research on political activism and social movements among students and feminists during the 2013 to 2014 Euromaidan mobilizations. Her ethnography, Without the State, Self-Organization, and Political Activism in Ukraine is forthcoming, and her edited volume, Decolonizing Queer Experience, LGBT Narratives, from Eastern Europe and Eurasia, was published in 2020. I'm really excited to turn it over to Emily and so glad that she is here tonight. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much, Allie, and thank you to everybody who's joined us tonight. I know there is so much to pay attention to in the world right now, especially in our own country, and I'm really, I feel a lot of gratitude for those of you who are willing to take some time out of your evening to talk a little bit more about Ukraine. Because as you know, of course, unfortunately, the war in Ukraine is still going on. We are just past the 100-day mark of this war. Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th of 2022. And the situation is to some extent the same and to some extent different. So tonight, I'll talk a little bit about, first of all, kind of how we got to where we are in this current war, what kind of claims Russia makes on Ukraine and why. But then I also want to talk a little bit about my recent experience in Warsaw, Poland, where I spent 3 weeks talking with and doing volunteer work with refugees from Ukraine. And these opening images are from the Central train station in Warsaw on the left and the Palace of Culture and Science on the right. You cannot escape the fact that there are so many Ukrainians in Warsaw right now. It kind of surrounds you. So like I said, the war has just passed the 100-day mark. And according to estimates by the United Nations, just over 4,000 civilians have been killed so far. And we can guess that the true number is much higher. There's a lot that we still don't know about what's been happening for the past 100 days. There are around 7 million refugees from Ukraine. So that's people who left Ukraine to go somewhere else. Most of them crossed Ukraine's western border into the European Union. And then there's also somewhere around 8 million people within the borders of Ukraine that are also displaced from their home, internally displaced people. The Ukrainian armed forces now claim that over 31,250 Russian soldiers have been killed in those 100 days. We actually don't know, this could also be an exaggeration, but the US has claimed that Russia lost about 25% of its combat power that it originally used in the invasion. So we know that the Russian losses are great, even if we're not entirely sure the exact numbers. The Russian government does admit that Russian soldiers are dying in Ukraine, although it restricts a lot of the access to this information. But we do know, that there are quite a lot of losses. And the BBC recently put out a report that they had actually been able to trace and identify around 4,000 Russian soldiers that have been killed, and they are just getting started. So how did we get here? Russia claims that Ukraine is not a country, and maybe I should say Russian President Vladimir Putin claims that Ukraine is not its own country. The reason for that is because Ukraine has been a part of various Russian empires over many years. Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire going back to the 17th century, but the city of Kyiv, which is the current day capital of Ukraine, which is right in the middle, was founded many years ago. It just celebrated its 1,540th birthday. And the empire that was built up around Kiev, called the Kievan Rus, it existed as early as the 800s, and that was far before the Russian Empire. And so one of the reasons that Russia claims that Ukraine is part of Russia is because Russia wants to claim this very long history that is actually part of Ukrainian history. And Ukrainian historians have claimed that this history is what makes Ukraine distinct from Russia all along. This includes in 1918, so right after World War II, you have the Russian Revolution that begins in 1917. That's when the Soviet Union starts to kind of come into existence. Many claims are being made on all of the territories that border Russia, including Ukraine. And at the same time, you have these activists in Ukraine who would like Ukraine to be its own country. So in 1918, they claim the Ukrainian People's Republic, which is a country that actually had very similar borders to contemporary Ukraine, that existed up until 1922, when ultimately that initiative to create an independent Ukraine was lost out to the growing Soviet power. So Ukraine did become part of the Soviet Union. It was part of the Soviet Union from 1922. In 1922, the Soviet Union extended just into this eastern part of Ukraine. That was much more quickly came in under the control of the Soviet Union, and it took the Soviets a lot longer to take over all of the territory all the way into Western Ukraine. The very far western part of Ukraine, so in particular these regions that are closest all the way in the west, closest to Poland, and closest to the rest of Europe, those didn't become part of the Soviet Union until 1945. So you can imagine that Ukraine and Ukrainians have never really considered themselves part of Russia. Many of them fought for many, many years against being part of the Soviet Union, as well as against being part of the Russian Empire before that. And there were also very many Soviet policies that were designed intentionally to try to crush this idea of an independent Ukraine. The worst example of this is the famine that was created intentionally by Joseph Stalin in 1932 and 1933. This famine is known as Holodomor, and it was intentionally designed to take over the grain and the food that was produced in Ukraine, take it away from the people who produced it, redistribute it elsewhere in the Soviet Union. And at the same time that this was happening, so this caused a famine in which at something like 4 million people died. We actually don't really know how many people died because the Stalin regime would not allow for counting of any of the casualties to be associated with this famine. So some estimates actually go up to as high as around 10 million people being killed by the famine, but really the general scholarly agreement is around 4 million. At the same time, Stalinist policies were targeting Ukrainian intellectuals, writers, artists, musicians. They were being repressed and often murdered or arrested and taken away to where they were political prisoners. This kind of destroying the heart of the idea of what made Ukraine Ukraine. This was absolutely done intentionally during the Stalin years. And I'm glossing over, obviously, thousands of years of history here, but the kind of key takeaway as we're looking at this map of contemporary Ukraine is that there's been this idea of Ukraine among Ukrainians for a very long time, despite the fact that Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, despite the fact that it was part of the Russian Empire. There have always been people who understood that Ukraine was different and separate and deserved its own country. And so the idea of fighting for this country goes back many generations. Ukraine became independent from the Soviet Union in 1991. This is a map that shows us the referendum on independence in all of the different regions of Ukraine. So Ukraine declared independence in August 24th in 1991, and then the country held a referendum so that everybody could vote in support. As you can see, every single region of Ukraine voted in favor of its independence in December of 1991. It's important to note, obviously, the western part of the country was very clearly in favor of Ukraine's independence. You can see it kind of, the numbers decrease as we go to the east, The lightest blue regions here are the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, which are the ones that are currently, unfortunately, in the news. These are the ones that have long been the most pro-Russian. They've been the most, in terms of their political representation, there's been the presence of pro-Russian politicians there for the longest. Many of the people in these regions speak Russian first, although most of them also know Ukrainian. But these are the regions that are now, being they're at kind of the heart of a lot of what's going on. And then I also want to point out, you can see that the Crimean Peninsula at the bottom here, we only had 54% of the votes in favor of independence. Small majority, but a majority all the same. And so I think it's really important for us to recognize just how important it was in 1991 for so many people to have supported Ukrainian independence. So now Ukraine has a population of around 44 million people, and it's also the largest country that is entirely in Europe. It's around 600,000 kilometers squared, or slightly smaller than the state of Texas. So I think an important question, other than the fact of where does Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, kind of come up with these claims? What has made him so insistent on stating that Ukraine is the same as Russia or is part of Russia? Excuse me, that's not what I want to do. And I want to kind of point out that Ukraine's development as a democracy is something that I think makes Vladimir Putin the most uncomfortable or the most upset about Ukraine kind of showing its difference from Russia. And I like the way this graphic shows us that over time, so you can see that Ukraine has had 5 presidents since the year 2000. Now, Ukraine is a very imperfect democracy. Many of these presidents were not especially democratic themselves. But the fact of the matter is that in all of these different time periods, there was a peaceful turnover of power, except in the year of 2014, when President Viktor Yanukovych, who is the guy you see in the Ukraine section in 2010, he was overthrown by protesters and then replaced by election by Poroshenko, who's the guy that you see in 2014 there. And then in 2019, of course, you recognize Volodymyr Zelensky, who was a TV comedian who decided to run for president in 2019 and was elected. I would also like to point out, just to give you a little bit of a richer picture of him, he actually has a degree in law. He is very well versed in the actual, systems and political systems in Ukraine. He's more qualified than he's often portrayed. And apparently he very much likes the poetry of Lina Kostenko, who is one of Ukraine's most famous dissident poets. He likes to quote it at random times. I learned that this week. So he's an interesting character and is certainly kind of coming into this role as an important hero of Ukraine right now. But the key point here is that, as you can see, obviously, the turnover of power in Russia has not been anything similar to that in Ukraine. Russia's president has been Vladimir Putin since the year 2000, except for one brief time period in the 2010s when Dmitry Medvedev was technically president, although at this time Putin served as prime minister, and so he was actually really in power all along. And then, of course, underneath you see Russia's most significant ally, Belarus, has had the same president, Alexander Lukashenko, since 2000 as well. Before that, I believe actually they've never had a different president. Both Russia and Belarus do claim to have democratic elections for the presidency, but neither of them do. Their elections are always rife with fraud, different claims to power. You might recall the last Belarusian elections, actually, Lukashenko put all the opposition candidates in jail. And so Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the wife of one of those candidates, actually ran for president and is largely recognized by a lot of people as the rightful president of Belarus. But the point here is that Ukraine is an imperfect democracy, but it's a democracy all the same. And this is what threatens Vladimir Putin, because if Ukraine can actually successfully be a democracy, that is something that would make it far too different from Russia. It would always be an independent country, and it also might make people in Russia think that they could have a democracy too. And I this idea about democracy in Ukraine, it's not new. This is a photo from those protests that I mentioned, the 2013-2014 Euromaidan protests. I took this photo in Kiev when I was there doing research. And these protests, they were really about Ukraine becoming its own country. They started out as being about Ukraine being in Europe, in the European Union in the future. But they were ultimately really about democracy. They were about Ukraine deciding for itself what it wanted to be in the future. And that's really where I think people decided that they did not want to be part of Russia anymore. And they didn't want Ukraine's most important economic and political ties to be with Russia either. And so we can actually see that really since 2014, there's been a lot of growing contention around these types of issues between Russia and Ukraine. Previous to 2014, most of Ukraine's political figures had ties to Russia. Ukraine had a lot of economic ties to Russia. The borders were very open. And it's not until the end of these protests when we start to see things really change. So not only do we see these important changes because of the protests, we see a shift in the people, in Ukrainians' own interest in their country's future, right? So they come out and they protest, they get a new government, and then they want to continue to be involved. So we see this more robust participation in political society. But at the same time, we also get, unfortunately, the first Russian invasion. So in March of 2014, there were separate, the territory of Crimea, which I pointed out in the earlier slide about the independence vote. Crimea was always, it was an autonomous republic of Ukraine. So that meant that it had different rights than the other regions of Ukraine. And it was largely Russian speaking. There were a lot of Russian residents there, and it had a lot of strong ties to Russia. And so in March of 2014, Russian troops invaded this peninsula very quietly without a lot of fanfare. They took it over and then held what they called a referendum for the people of Crimea to decide if they wanted to stay part of Ukraine. Of course, the result of that referendum was that Crimea wanted to be part of Russia. I will add that most people do not see that referendum as having any legitimacy. Many different groups of people were either prevented from voting in the referendum. So for instance, the indigenous Crimean Tatar population, many of the key political figures were actually not allowed into the peninsula to vote. And then many others boycotted that vote because they knew it wouldn't be legitimate. But in this way, the Crimean Peninsula was taken over. Russia now claims that this territory is part of Russia, despite the fact that this indigenous population in particular, as well as many other residents, didn't want it to become part of Russia. And then after this takeover, separatist groups in the territories of Luhansk and Donetsk, which you can see here, decided that they would also like to have a referendum to become part of Russia. So what initially started in 2014 as separatist takeovers of certain cities in these regions, ultimately Russian troops did cross the Ukrainian border to fight on behalf of those separatists. And the Ukrainian military responded, and that is when the war in the Donbass really began in the summer, in April, and then later in the summer of 2014. So as you can see, so I chose a map that's from 2015, largely because the amount of territory that was claimed by the separatists up until February 24th of 2022 was relatively stable. It was a small portion of 2 of Ukraine's regions. So the part that's in gray that you see here, that part of the territory was controlled by the Ukrainian government. And the part that you see here in red, that was considered to be the temporarily occupied territories. So most of the people there, this was I don't want to say like a cold conflict. There was still fighting. There were still soldiers being killed. But the contact line between these 2 parts of the territory was largely stable. And those territories it was more or less under control, although the war was still going on. COVID changed a lot of things for that. This border between these 2 parts of the government controlled and non-government controlled territories, it had been very fluid but COVID forced these borders to be shut down. And so there were rather a lot of people who kind of got stuck in the red parts of the territories and they were unable to leave. And in the past 2 years, Russia also started giving people in those territories Russian passports and opening this border to Russia. So sort of making the people who were living in those red parts of the territories turn toward Russia a little bit even before this war began. And so I think, we can see a lot of these policies that Russia was putting forward in the past 8 years that now sort of can be understood as a precursor to the invasion that began on the 24th. And I think there's a lot that we can learn from those events. So I want to give a little bit of an idea about the most recent developments in this war. The landscape of the war has changed really dramatically from when it began. As you can see, you may recall, in the first few days of war, the news every day was Kyiv will fall tomorrow, and it didn't. Russian troops did encircle much of the northern part of the country. They destroyed several important cities in northern Ukraine. The Ukrainian military, I want to make one point, which is that in 2014, when the war began, the Ukrainian military was absolutely in shambles and had very little capacity and relied largely on volunteer battalions. But over the course of the past 8 years, the Ukrainian military has been dramatically reformed. And so its capacity now is so much better than it was in 2014, which is part of why we've seen so much great success. And I will also note that while the United States did not provide lethal military aid to Ukraine for most of that time period, the United States and Canada did contribute a lot of training, which at the time seemed a little useless to me. But now I can see that these training exercises, US and Canadian soldiers were always in Ukraine, training people with the newest technologies. That's one of the reasons that the Ukrainian soldiers are so competent these days, is because they have this extensive training. So as far as, the Russian takeover of all of Ukraine goes, that is not happening as of yet. Kyiv, there was a bomb dropped in Kyiv yesterday, so I don't want to give anyone the impression that, there's no likelihood of that happening again. But the concentration of Russian troops has largely shifted to the east. So you've probably been paying attention to this sort of shift here. You've seen that Russian troops in the Black Sea and Crimea have come and taken this whole kind of southern corridor over. So now technically the Russia's border with Ukraine comes, much further west in Ukraine than it did previously. On this map up in the top right, you can see a little bit more specifically some of the actual areas of conflict. So right now, the Ukrainian forces are trying to hold on to Zaporizhia, which is in Donetsk Oblast here in the middle. That's where there's a very significant, huge nuclear power station that the Ukrainian forces are trying to protect. Ukrainian forces are, of course, also trying to hold Odessa, which is a very key Black Sea port city. But the Russian troops are obviously focusing, if you look at the bottom right, on Donetsk and Luhansk regions, which is, of course, the territory that had been split from the war that began in 2014. And so you've probably seen the name of the city Severodonetsk in the news lately. That's the city right here on the bottom right map that has really been at, it's really the focal point of the conflict right now. Every couple of hours when I check the news, it's something a little bit different. I think the last time I checked, the Ukrainian forces had pushed the Russians back rather a lot. But I just, one of the real tragedies of this is that these are cities that, they were part of the government-controlled territories of Ukraine for a number of years since the war began, and they held a lot of people who had already been displaced from the cities where the war had been the hottest. They had been rebuilt, so they hosted a lot of people who were displaced, who had lost their homes. People had rebuilt their entire lives. Severodonetsk is one of these cities. Kramatorsk is one of these cities. Mariupol was one of these cities. And these are cities that are being absolutely, completely destroyed. Mariupol does not exist anymore. It is 100%, every single building in that city has been at least damaged, if not completely destroyed. and hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced from there. So, you know, these military operations, obviously that's the huge question here. But the actual impact on people and the people who were living what they thought were safe lives in Ukraine, you know, that's we're talking about billions of dollars in damage that is going to take years to rebuild. And not just people's homes being damaged and destroyed, but infrastructure, schools, hospitals. I think there's something like, you know, one hospital left in Kramatorsk, which is a city of several 100,000 people, right? And roads are being destroyed. So the whole network, you know, of infrastructure in Ukraine. The bomb that was dropped on Kiev yesterday was on a train repair depot. So there clearly is this intentional kind of targeting of infrastructural capacity so that Ukraine, not only are things destroyed, but then they can't be rebuilt. And I would also, you know, I really have to note, unfortunately, it looks like this war is also going to cause a rather major food crisis in the world. Ukraine was a huge exporter of grain. So in addition to much of that grain being stuck at the ports in southern Ukraine in places like Mariupol, you know, the Russian forces have prevented this grain from getting to where it needed to go, which was largely to countries in Africa. So in addition to the existing grain not leaving, the harvest has been negatively impacted. You know, farmland and equipment has been intentionally destroyed. Grain silos are being set on fire. So it isn't just this year's harvest that's going to be a problem. It's going to be the next few years that are also a huge problem. So I think that kind of segues into some of the discussion that I want to have about this, the kind of human movement that's one of the important aspects of this. So as I mentioned before, so I get a lot of my data from the United Nations Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. And they give a lot of nice up-to-date data, although I'll talk a little bit about why some of the data is not, you know, not necessarily correct. So 7 million refugees coming from Ukraine. So that's 7 million people who have crossed an international border since February 24th. As of today, we see almost 3.7 million of those people have gone to Poland. That's this number here. And then we've got almost 700,000 have gone to Hungary, almost 600,000 to Romania, and then just under 500,000 to Moldova and Slovakia, which I will point out are very tiny countries with very small populations. So this huge influx of Ukrainians is something, you know, it's noticeable, it's important, and it changes the demographic of those countries. I hope that the box isn't covering up the top there. The number for the number of people who have gone to Belarus is 16,000 some. I did a similar presentation last week where the number was 26,000, so that dropped dramatically. And I think the reason is because we have no real idea how many Ukrainians are crossing the border to Belarus, because, you know, how would we trust the Belarus border guards to give us the accurate number? The bigger number here, the UN is reporting over 1 million people who have left for Russia. Now, some of those people are certainly Ukrainians who decided to flee to Russia when the war started because they were pro-Russian, they had affinities for Russia, and they would prefer to live in Russia. You know, some of those people might also be people in the temporarily occupied territories who had Russian passports. I am not sure if this number includes the people who have been forcibly displaced from the Donetsk and Luhansk regions by Russia since February 24th. You know, there's in a lot of the cities that Russia has taken over, such as Mariupol, many people have been taken through Russia. They started these, what they're calling filtration camps, where they would decide if they would take somebody from Ukraine and keep them in a camp, kind of arrest them for being, you know, too pro-Ukrainian, or let them go. There's a lot of unknown information here. We don't really know what the criteria for people getting in or out is, but we do know that, you know, hundreds of thousands of people have been forced to go to Russia against their will. Some of them are slowly trickling out, so we do have a little bit of reason for optimism, but Russia is also holding a very large number of prisoners, including many of the soldiers who fought and defended Mariupol up until the last days. They're all being held prisoner in Russia right now. So I also want to note that the number of internally displaced people, so that's people who have gone from somewhere in Ukraine to somewhere else in Ukraine, and that number is being estimated right now at around 8 million people. The majority of those people have gone into the Western regions, although kind of the South, the kind of East and or West and South are the most popular places to go. It's difficult really to assess the true number of people, and that's partly because we keep using this term internally displaced, but we don't really know if that means that people have moved temporarily or if they are homeless. Has their home been destroyed? Is it safe for them to go back in any capacity? Many of these homes and many of the roads going to people's homes are mined still, so it's not safe for people to return. We really have no way yet to assess this kind of damage. I mean, we can find numbers that the Ukrainian government puts out, but we really don't exactly know the real scale and how long it might take to get people home, if they even have, homes to go to. So I also, just to give you a explanation of the graphics on here, the UN, if you look at the UN map that I took this picture from, the red spots are the where hostilities are happening. Obviously, this changes every day. When I first started giving presentations about Ukraine, when the war started, the map was red all over the country. Now most of the red is focused in this eastern part, but obviously we're still seeing missile strikes happening across the country, like I said, including in Kiev and often in Western Ukraine as well. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the maybe more positive experiences based on the time that I spent in Poland, because I think it's really, at the same time that this war is dragging on, it's going, it's over 100 days. We don't really see an end in sight. It's truly remarkable, the response that countries like Poland have had to help people. I want to point out first that the number of refugees, like as I mentioned, it's almost 3.7 million people that's being claimed according to those UN figures that I mentioned. But that number is actually not quite accurate as well. And the reason for this is because that number, 3.7 million people, that is simply the number of people who crossed the border from Ukraine to Poland. That's every single person who has crossed that time since February 24th. So if you're, for example, a humanitarian aid worker and you're driving a truck into Ukraine and back out of Ukraine and then making another delivery and making another exit, you're counted every single time you cross the border. You're not a refugee though, right? So some of these numbers aren't entirely accurate in terms of telling us who is a refugee and how many refugees there are. And I also want to point out that the images that you see right now are from the central train station in Warsaw. If you are Ukrainian and you go to the central train station in Warsaw, you can get free transportation to many other destinations around Europe. So the other aspect to this counting question is that many people who went to Warsaw, crossed the border into Poland and came through Warsaw are now somewhere else in Europe. So they are not actually refugees in Poland. So at the same time that, I just want to make sure that the kind of shifting, movement of people and the shifting needs is understood, because I think that's, one of the things that will drag out in this is this consistent movement of people and not really having a clear idea of how many people are moving all the time. I heard estimates while I was there that there are about 300,000 Ukrainians in Warsaw alone. Warsaw is a city of around 2 million people, so that's a gigantic number of Ukrainians. And Ukrainians, actually, the Polish government, when the war started, lifted its border restrictions so that it would be easier for Ukrainians to come to Poland. You didn't need an international passport. They lifted their COVID restrictions. They also lifted their documentation requirement for pets so that people could bring their pets with them. And so it's there was absolutely a huge flood of people into Poland. And unfortunately, from my colleagues who have been doing research on the border, unfortunately, most of the large aid organizations like the United Nations, like the International Organization of Migration, like the International Red Cross, all of those have been completely absent from the border, from Warsaw, from any humanitarian response. The biggest international organization that has been present at the border and in Poland is the World Central Kitchen. And that was, they have a hot food tent that anybody from Ukraine who has a passport stamped after February 2014, or sorry, after February 24th, anybody can go in and get a hot meal at any time of the day. This tent works all hours of the day. It closes for 1 hour from 3 or 4 in the morning to clean, and otherwise anybody can go in. The World Central Kitchen, they also have aid programs in Ukraine, and they contract out to local chefs and basically give them money to serve free food to as many people as they can. And so the local Polish team at this tent in Warsaw, they just churn out soup, hot food. Sometimes they get donations of sandwiches. Every now and then they'll get donations of, cake or donuts or something. And then of course, all the little kids get to have a little treat. But the way that this place is organized, it's really remarkable. It's all based on volunteers. The majority of the volunteers in the tent, in the kitchen aspect of the initiative are international, so Americans, some Ukrainians as well. There's also volunteers who are working within the train station to help people navigate, their free transportation, to get medical care, to help them get SIM cards for their phones so that they can stay in contact with their loved ones in Ukraine. It's really remarkable how many people have come forward. And as I said, this isn't from big organizations. This is just average people who wanted to help and wanted to do something. And so they did. So that was one of the places that I worked in Warsaw. And the other place was called the Centrum Pomocy Mokotów, which is a humanitarian point, or they called it a free shop. And basically, similar situation, if you had a Ukrainian passport stamped after February 24th, you could come into this free shop, you could get a bag of groceries. On the left, I have an image of all the different kind of groceries that they had, lots of dry goods, cosmetics as well, soap, dishwashing liquid, they had pet food, they had diapers, they had a little bit of everything. Also, all donations from average people. Sometimes they would get a big donation from, some grocery store or something. They almost never actually could predict what they would get. So one time I went and they had just toilet bowl cleaner, hundreds and hundreds of bottles of toilet bowl cleaner. But something that people don't realize that they might need. But it was truly just, the scale of this is amazing. And then you can see on the right that they also had a kind of clothes shop. So people who, a lot of the refugees came to Poland in February in the winter, they didn't have summer clothes at all. So they were able to come and look around for different clothes that they need, get clothes for their kids, all kinds of, sometimes they got a shipment or a donation of toys. So the little kids had something to play with. They also have a really active Facebook page that I'm still following, where, sometimes the Ukrainian family will say, oh my gosh, I really need this thing. Does anybody have it? Within a few hours, somebody will respond and say, of course, have it for you, give you a stroller or whatever. Or you'll get Polish people saying, hey, I have all this stuff I want to donate. What should I do? It's really a very self-organized initiative, again, also run by volunteers, mostly Polish people. And the Polish volunteers at this free shop, almost none of them had any humanitarian background. They were artists, they were filmmakers, some anthropologists, one woman worked at Amazon. They came from all different walks of life and they just wanted to help. Unfortunately, the shop is closing at the end of this month. The premises that you can see on the bottom right, they're not able to keep those premises, but they actually have this great plan to start offering Polish language classes for refugees, for example, and just helping Ukrainians kind of navigate the Polish bureaucracy while they're in Poland. So it's really interesting and I think very heartening in a lot of ways to see how people have responded in such generous ways, in ways that they, didn't have to. I want to leave enough time for questions, but I just wanted to give everybody a chance to look at some options of how you can help if you are in a position and you want to donate something. I really, honestly, World Central Kitchen is the most present and they're doing just wonderful, work with as little, a very small amount of money can go a long way because of the way that they're organized. You can directly donate to the free shop that I mentioned. I can also put these links in the chat here. And if you're someone who would like to do such a thing, I highly recommend the charity Come Back Alive, which supports the Ukrainian Armed Forces. It helps them get equipment, it helps them be stronger, and it also helps them, with medical needs and that sort of thing. It's a very well-regarded charity, recommended by most of my Ukrainian friends. I also recommend continuing to contact your representatives. If you're passionate about Ukraine and the United States continuing to help Ukraine, obviously, and unfortunately, this war is going to continue for some time. So the more we keep at our representatives to ask them to help, it really keeping this in their ears, I think, is really significant. And lastly, I understand that we can really feel helpless sometimes in the face of something that's so big that we have no control over. But even just being here, continuing to pay attention to Ukraine is important, and reading news sources that are correct, that tell us good information about what's happening. I highly recommend the Kyiv Independent. That's a totally crowd-funded Ukraine-based initiative. It's all online. And the journalism that they do there is really fantastic. They have war correspondents, they have foreign correspondents, they have people working all over, and they're very well regarded. And then also the Ukrainian Research Institute website, we have links to other places where you can find good information. We have links to different experts and what experts are writing. And so we're really happy to continue to share that information. So thanks again for attending. I'm looking forward to having some of your questions here.
Emily, thank you so much for really sharing your insight and personal direct experience. It's been really nice it's been great to have you here tonight. I will open it up to questions. I do have 2 that are in the chat so far. For everyone here, you can submit questions directly to me in the chat. You can also unmute yourself. And then, Emily, while you're answering, I just started to send some links in the chat, but I'll continue to do that for everyone, for those organizations that you listed. I might just need your slide to come back up for a little bit, yes, so I can grab those names. But so the questions I got, this was back kind of towards the beginning of your presentation. And the question was just more clear, fuller definition around when you use the term indigenous in regards to Ukraine. What does that actually mean, especially in terms of country as well?
Yeah, so this is a great question. Ukraine is an interesting case because it is, and it claims to be, I mean, this is part of the Ukrainian identity right now. Ukraine is a very ethnically diverse country. So we think of Ukraine as maybe being very homogeneous. All people are Slavic, all people are Orthodox or Christian of some kind, and that's not very true. That is certainly the majority. There are many different ethnic groups in Western Ukraine that still identify with these with their heritage, like Lemko and Boyko. They have interesting traditions that I won't really get into. But when I use the term indigenous and talking specifically about the Crimean Tatar population, this is a question that has really fascinated me for the past few years. So the Crimean Tatars are a population that has lived in the Crimean Peninsula for thousands of years. They claim to have a kind of mixed heritage that came from the trade routes in the Black Sea that all converged in this peninsula in southern Ukraine. They were targeted in the Russian Empire by Catherine the Great, and then they were also targeted in the Stalinist regime. Stalin deported the Crimean Tatar population, claimed that they were what's the word, Nazi sympathizers, deported almost the entire population to Central Asia, and then killed everybody who was left. And so the Crimean Tatar population, they're a largely Muslim population who claims that they actually decided as a kind of, they have a lot of really interesting, self-governing bodies and political leaders and everything. They decided that they would claim status as an indigenous population because international organizations like the United Nations recognize the rights of indigenous people. And they sort of, I don't want to use the word strategy as like a negative thing, but basically the community leaders figured out, Russia is repressing our rights. This happened after 2014 when the peninsula was invaded. They realized that if they could get recognized by international organizations as an indigenous population, they would actually have a right to that land of the Crimean Peninsula that Russia was denying them. And so that's why I use the term. It's because the Crimean, I know it's a very long answer for what might have been an easy question, but I just think the whole how the story ended up unfolding was just really fascinating. This very like intentional effort to be indigenous. And I will also say that, you know, Russia also has indigenous populations, and Russia has its own definition of who can be seen as indigenous or a minority population. And they have long denied the Crimean Tatars this status because of, you know, ongoing efforts to repress their rights. And so I think it's, you know, it's important for us to recognize when they're using these terms themselves. You know, that's what we should call them. So that's the very long answer to that question.
Yeah, and the person who asked said, very helpful, and that was not too long an answer.
Thank you.
We do have a few, several questions coming in. So another one was, is the charge of the Light Brigade about Crimea, and what was that war?
Yes, the Crimean War. Yes, I mean, well, that's from what it is about the Crimean War. The Crimean War took place during the Russian Empire. This is very far outside of my area of expertise. So I'm going to go ahead and just stop the share, if that's okay. I don't have a great answer. It's about Crimea. It's not really about Ukraine, because Ukraine as such did not exist at that time. But it is about Crimea and the Crimean War.
Thank you. Okay, let's see what's next. And if anybody wants to personally ask their question, you're more than welcome to jump in and unmute yourself. So another question is, who are Ukraine's closest allies in the region?
Well, right now, Poland is absolutely Ukraine's biggest ally. You know, most of the close, I don't know, this is a complex question. It changes every day, other than the answer that Poland is the best ally. Ukraine's neighbors have been pretty sympathetic. They have largely been responsible for, you know, recognizing that Ukraine needs military aid. They are, I don't know if anybody saw the story recently. So Lithuania, of course, is the Baltic country that has the closest border with Russia, and also has a large number of Russians as well in the country. And the Lithuanian population raised $3 million to buy Ukraine a drone, an anti-tank drone, so that they could destroy Russian tanks. The Lithuanian population raised this $3 million to buy it from Turkey. And then Turkey decided that after seeing such goodwill, they would just give it to them for free and then use the rest of the $3 million for humanitarian aid. So we have a lot of stories like that, right? Where, you know, small countries like Poland, like Lithuania, like Romania, Moldova, they've been really helpful. They've created policies, you know, they've tried to give as much military aid as they can, even though they're tiny countries. Unfortunately, countries like Hungary, which is one of Ukraine's closest neighbors, they, you know, are very far into Vladimir Putin's pocket. And so really, you know, let me phrase it this way. The problem isn't exactly that people want to help, people in these countries want to help Ukraine. It's that the governments can't distance themselves from Russian control in ways, especially around energy politics. So a lot of these countries rely on Russian natural gas to heat their homes in the winter. And so their governments can't just cancel their relationship with Russia, even though the entire population might want to, because they simply wouldn't be able to run their country. So what is happening is that while there are many countries that are supportive of a for example, like a ban on Russian imports, you know, Hungary has decided we can't live without Russian gas, so we have to find a loophole. And so it's become very difficult in the long term. At the beginning, we saw a very united response, but in the longer term, we started to see countries, especially leaders that have had influence from Russia, you know, they're unable to really put a strong front up against Russia. So, I mean, it's a challenging question. It changes all the time. France has been okay, but they've done poorly lately, I would say, in this whole let's appease Vladimir Putin response. Boris Johnson in the UK has probably been the biggest European ally, you know, in terms of size. The UK has been the most important one. It's a shifting scene.
Yeah, so speaking of Putin, we have a couple of questions. I'm going to kind of group them together because they're similar. One is, do you think that this is Putin's swan song, or will he keep going? And then a different question was, any chance for a diplomatic solution with Putin soon? Can the United States help more with negotiating peace?
Mhm. So I'm of the opinion that we owe Vladimir Putin no negotiation. In any negotiation situation, Ukraine will have to give something up, and that's unacceptable to me. They were, absolutely unprovoked, and Russia invaded their country and is now claiming that it should be given some of its territory. I don't think that's acceptable, and I don't think that's acceptable for any world that we want to live in, where countries and borders matter at all. The best thing that the United States can do is to give Ukraine more military aid. And the reason for that is because Russia is not going to stop this assault until they have taken over Ukraine. I know I mentioned at the beginning that Kiev taking over Ukraine was the goal all along, and that hasn't been very successful. But most of the intelligence reports that are being released now are saying that that is still the goal, and that is still what Vladimir Putin will try to do. So the best way to respond, really the best way to protect people's lives, is to give more military aid. I don't trust any Russian negotiators. I mean, there were attempts at some negotiations, and several of the Ukrainian negotiators were poisoned. These are not good faith actors. You can't bring them to the table and expect them to respect a promise that they make. So I personally just don't see any future in negotiating and diplomacy. I see, Vladimir Putin has to be stopped, and whatever the US can do to help Ukraine do that, I think they should do. And I should say, a lot of that is happening. The US is, doing rather a lot, could always do more, but the US is responding, I think, pretty strongly.
Great. And Emily, just before so I don't forget, I'm not sure which link you wanted or you were going to share for Centrum. So I'm just putting that there, and then I know you have your own link. So I don't want to share the wrong thing out.
Yes.
But I think I grabbed everything else of the different organizations that you put up there. And one of the last questions, actually, I think it is the last question that we have, is was it a mistake when the world didn't do anything about the 2014 invasion?
Yes. In retrospect, absolutely. I mean, I don't think we could have necessarily known it at the time. But now looking back, I really think that moment, that lack of response, allowed Vladimir Putin to take a couple of steps back and say, okay, how much can I get away with? Because he understands, Putin is in some ways, he doesn't underthink things, right? Taking that time from 2014 to figure out what to do in 2022, like that seems like a long time, but at the same time, I'm not that surprised that he would think about it for that long. The timing is very particular. I think that the election of President Zelensky also made a difference here, because I think Vladimir Putin thought that perhaps he would be kind of a weak figure that Ukraine wouldn't rally behind. But yeah, that lack of response, very small sanctions on a couple of people, creating enough instability in Eastern Ukraine that Ukraine would not be allowed to be admitted into NATO or into the European Union. The fact that Ukraine was not able to get any of those kinds of protection in those 8 years made it so that now the world is scrambling in 2022 to respond. It's not. I don't want to say that every single step was premeditated. I don't think he's that smart. But I do think Vladimir Putin is good at testing the waters. If you look at for instance, cyber attacks on elections and that sort of thing, all of that stuff, that Russia has been known to do was tested out in Ukraine before it got transported somewhere else. So Putin has always kind of used Ukraine as this testing ground to see what he can get away with. And 2014, I think, was absolutely no exception. The world didn't do very much because our reliance on Russian natural gas was too much. Because it seemed far away, because we wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, any number of reasons. And I think, unfortunately, that's led us to where we are today.
Yeah. So Emily, we have two questions and we only really have 2 minutes left. So these are more about the human trauma that is experiencing. And one question is, the 200,000 children were sent to Russia, and where did they go? And then the next question is a lot about the sexual violence and just against women and girls by soldiers, and the scale of it. And do you know if there's any aid being offered, maybe in both of these areas?
Yeah, unfortunately, for this question of what's happening to anybody in Russia who is forcibly deported to Russia, we still are, we don't have a lot of information. We are getting kind of some testimonials of what's happening. So some people who are getting out of Russia and into other countries and safer locations are able to tell their stories. But of course, you know, we're hearing stories of torture and violence and all sorts of things. You know, unfortunately, we're seeing a very targeted, I mean, this is why experts are using the word genocide to talk about what's happening in Ukraine, because it isn't just the indiscriminate killing of civilians, which is also happening, but in places like Mariupol and in places in southern and eastern Ukraine, we've seen Russian soldiers burning Ukrainian history textbooks and replacing Ukrainian school curriculum with Russian school curriculum and forcing students to speak Russian and not Ukrainian. So it's also about this indoctrination of young people into accepting what's happening to them. And you know, we can't really know the extent of this, unfortunately, until those places are liberated. And as far as the question of sexual violence goes, so I can't point you specifically toward anything that's happening right now, but I know that there are Ukrainians who are organizing things like testimonials, you know, getting people on record with their stories. These are absolutely, there is already at least one, I think there's probably several cases that are already open about war crimes in specifics related to Bucha, one of the cities north of Kyiv that was occupied and then liberated by the Ukrainian forces, occupied by Russians and then liberated by the Ukrainians. So there are already cases of war crimes, like war crimes tribunals that will be happening about that. And so there are people, you know, Ukrainians who are spearheading the initiative to take those testimonials. And that does include things about sexual violence and these stories of violence against women that we've seen. So definitely, you know, like I said, I don't necessarily, a lot of this stuff is still unfolding. So I think, you know, we'll see larger scale kind of reports and assessments later. The fact of the matter is that we know that it's happening. Luckily, there has already been a couple of great, if you want to look at kind of previous examples of research of this, I recommend the Invisible Battalion. So this was this research about sexual violence in Ukraine in the first 8 years of the war. It's by very reputable sociologists, some of my colleagues. I anticipate that they are also spearheading some of this research on sexual violence as well. So that's certainly something that people are aware of and are working on. I would just advocate for continuing, you know, to support Ukrainian voices that are doing that and not, you know, I've had a lot of people kind of indicate to me that it's people aren't doing enough, but actually, you know, Ukrainians are very well aware of the kind of evidence that they will need to successfully hold Russia accountable for these crimes, and they're doing really a good job of getting a lot of this evidence, and that includes in this case that you've mentioned.
Emily, it's 8:02, and I'm going to thank you for your time tonight. And I know you have plans to go back to Poland, and so I just wish you a really safe trip, and thank you for the work that you're doing and the awareness and advocacy that you're bringing, because you've been speaking at not just several public libraries around the state, but I know you have a lot of speaking engagements, and the more awareness that you bring to all these different communities, the more awareness we all have. So thank you again, Emily, and thank you all tonight for your questions, for being here. I hope you enjoyed this talk and will take something from it. So enjoy the rest of your night. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. Bye. Thank you.
Bye, Emily.